In the final months of the Second World War, the Pacific conflict had already reached a level of destruction that was difficult for ordinary people to imagine. Cities across Japan had been bombed repeatedly, leaving neighborhoods in ashes and families struggling to survive among ruins. Food was scarce, infrastructure was broken, and the population lived with constant air raid sirens and fear from the sky. Yet despite these hardships, the Japanese government had not surrendered. Military leaders believed that continuing the fight, even at great cost, might secure better terms or protect national honor. Across the ocean, American leaders faced their own terrible calculations. The war in Europe had ended, but the fighting in Asia continued, and plans for a full invasion of Japan predicted massive casualties on both sides. In this tense atmosphere, a secret project that had been underway for years, the Manhattan Project, reached its conclusion, producing a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. Before dawn on August 6, 1945, on a small Pacific island called Tinian, American airmen prepared for a mission that only a handful of them fully understood. The weapon they carried was nicknamed Little Boy, but the name disguised its terrifying power. It used nuclear fission, a reaction that split atoms and released energy on a scale never before used in war. The crew of the B-29 bomber, later known as the Enola Gay, took off into the dark sky. Some of the men were nervous, others focused purely on their technical duties, but few could truly grasp what would happen when the bomb was released. Far below, the city of Hiroshima was just waking up. It was a military center, but also home to schools, hospitals, shops, and families beginning another summer day. Children walked to school, workers headed to factories, and streetcars moved along their routes. The sky was mostly clear, and the earlier air raid warnings had been lifted, giving people a sense of cautious relief. At 8:15 in the morning, the bomb was dropped. For a brief moment, it fell silently, unnoticed by most people on the ground. Then the world changed. A blinding flash, brighter than the sun, filled the sky. In an instant, temperatures near the center of the explosion soared to levels hotter than the surface of the sun. A massive fireball formed, and a shockwave tore outward faster than sound. Buildings were crushed as if made of paper, roofs collapsed, windows shattered, and wooden homes burst into flames. Thousands of people who were outdoors or near windows were burned by the intense heat. Some were killed so quickly that their bodies left dark shadows on walls and pavement, where the light had bleached the surrounding surface. Those closest to the blast had no chance to react. Others farther away were thrown across rooms or buried under debris. In the minutes that followed, confusion and horror spread. Survivors who could move stumbled through streets that no longer looked familiar. Landmarks had vanished. Fires raged everywhere, fed by broken gas lines, wooden structures, and scattered debris. People's clothes were torn away, and their skin hung in strips from severe burns. Many called out for FAMI, Lie members, not knowing if they were alive or dead. Water became the most desperate need. Victims of burns and radiation felt unbearable thirst, yet much of the city's water system was destroyed. Rivers and ponds filled with injured people seeking relief, some collapsing into the water and never rising again. Medical help was almost non-existent. Hospitals had been damaged, doctors and nurses were among the dead or wounded, and supplies were destroyed. What made the situation even more terrifying was something no one could see: radiation. Along with the blast and heat, the explosion released invisible particles and rays that passed through bodies and buildings. People who had survived the initial destruction began to feel sick in the hours and days that followed. They vomited, grew weak, and developed fevers. Hair fell out in clumps. Purple spots appeared on the skin from internal bleeding. At the time, most doctors did not fully understand radiation sickness. They tried to treat symptoms with limited tools while watching patients deteriorate without clear explanation. Some who had seemed only lightly injured suddenly died. Others lingered in pain for weeks. Communication with the outside world was nearly impossible at first. The city was cut off, its infrastructure shattered. When reports finally reached Japanese authorities, even they struggled to understand what kind of weapon could cause such destruction with a single bomb. Photographs later showed a vast, flattened area where neighborhoods had once stood. Of the roughly 350,000 people in Hiroshima that morning, tens of thousands were dead by the end of the day. Many more were injured. Fires continued to burn, merging into a firestorm that consumed what little remained standing. Families were separated, and countless children were left orphaned in a matter of seconds. In the following days, survivors searched for loved ones among the ruins. They wrote names on scraps of paper, asked strangers for news, and located through makeshift shelters filled with the wounded. The smell of smoke and death hung in the air. Relief teams from outside the city brought what help they could, but they too were exposed to radiation, sometimes without knowing it. The psychological shock was as deep as the physical wounds. People struggled to understand how a single bomb could destroy an entire city. Rumors spread. Some said it was a new type of poison, others that the sun had fallen from the sky. Fear of another attack lingered constantly. For the American leadership, the bombing was presented as a way to force a quick end to the war. They believed that, demonstrating such overwhelming power might compel Japan to surrender without an invasion that could cost hundreds of thousands of lives. However, the human reality on the ground in Hiroshima was not a strategic calculation but a landscape of suffering. Civilians, elderly people, mothers, children, made up a large portion of the victims. Their stories, praise RV'd in diaries, testimonies, and memories, describe ordinary moments suddenly turned into nightmares. A mother preparing breakfast when the flash came, a student sitting in class, a shopkeeper opening a store. Life was divided forever into before and after that morning. The bombing of Hiroshima marked a turning point not only in the war but in human history. For the first time, humanity had used nuclear energy as a weapon, revealing a capacity for destruction that could threaten entire civilizations. Scientists who had worked on the bomb felt mixed emotions. Some believed they had helped end a brutal war, while others were haunted by the consequences. Survivors of Hiroshima, later called hibakusha, carried physical scars and long-term health problems, but also the burden of memory. Many dedicated their lives to speaking about what they experienced, hoping future generations would understand the cost of nuclear war. In the weeks, months, and years after the explosion, the city slowly began to rebuild, but the loss could never be fully repaired. Graves were marked, memorials were built, and August 6 became a day of remembrance. The story of that morning remains one of the most powerful reminders of both the extremes of human conflict and the urgent need for restraint, empathy, and peace. 3 days after the destruction of Hiroshima, while confusion and fear still gripped Japan and the world struggled to understand what had happened, another American bomber prepared for a second mission. On the morning of August 9, 1945, the city of Nagasaki was beginning its day much like Hiroshima had before its own disaster. Nagasaki was an important port and industrial center, surrounded by hills that shaped its neighborhoods into valleys and districts. It was home to shipyards, factories, schools, markets, and families who had already endured years of war shortages and air raids. Yet few could imagine that within hours their city would become the site of the second and last use of atomic weapons in war. The bomber, a B-29 named Boxcar, took off from Tinian Island, carrying a plutonium-based atomic bomb nicknamed Fat Man. Unlike the uranium bomb used on Hiroshima, this weapon relied on a more complex design, but the result would be just as catastrophic. The mission itself was filled with complications from the start. Mechanical issues, weather concerns, and visibility over the primary target created tension among the crew. Fuel was limited, and decisions had to be made under pressure. Eventually, Nagasaki became the target as clouds obscured other locations. Below, most residents had gone about their routines. Some workers were already in factories, children were indoors or helping families, and others were still dealing with earlier conventional bomb damage. Air raid sirens had sounded in previous days so often that people sometimes reacted with weary routine rather than panic. At 11:02 in the morning, the bomb was released. Moments later, a brilliant flash split the sky, followed by an immense explosion, though the surrounding hills somewhat contained the blast compared to the flatter landscape of Hiroshima. The destruction within the main impact zone was still overwhelming. A fireball formed in the air, and a shockwave raced outward, crushing buildings, snapping trees, and hurling debris like deadly projectiles. Wooden homes collapsed instantly, and even reinforced concrete structures suffered heavy damage. Factories central to the war effort were destroyed, but so were homes, churches, schools, and hospitals. Thousands of people were killed in the first seconds, many without ever knowing what had struck them. The heat from the explosion caused severe burns over wide areas. Clothing ignited, skin blistered, and people caught outdoors had little chance to escape injury. Glass shattered across the city, sending shards flying into rooms and streets. Survivors described a roaring sound like a giant wind, followed by darkness as smoke and dust filled the air. Fires broke out across Nagasaki, merging into larger blazes that consumed entire neighborhoods. Those who could still move scurried through scenes of devastation, calling for help or searching for relatives. Some wandered in shock, their faces and bodies so badly burned that others could hardly recognize them. Again, Radiation added a silent layer of suffering. Invisible particles released in the explosion penetrated bodies and contaminated the environment. People who had been inside buildings believing they were safe from the blast were still exposed. In the hours after the bombing, many began to feel nausea, dizziness, and weakness. Medical workers who survived tried to organize aid, but their facilities were damaged, supplies were scarce, and they faced a flood of casualties far beyond what they could handle. Doctors and nurses treated burns, fractures, and wounds while witnessing symptoms they did not fully understand: bleeding gums, high fevers, and sudden collapses. Nagasaki had a significant Christian community, and churches that had stood for generations were reduced to rubble. In one cathedral, worshippers and clergy were among the victims. Across the city, religious sites of different faiths, along with cultural landmarks, were destroyed in seconds. The bombing did not distinguish between soldier and civilian, adult and child. Many of the dead were workers forced into wartime labor, elderly residents unable to flee, and young people whose lives had barely begun. Families were shattered, parents lost children, children lost parents, and entire households disappeared. Rescue efforts were chaotic and dangerous. Fires, unstable buildings, and radiation threatened those trying to help. Water sources were contaminated or blocked, and transportation was crippled. Makeshift shelters were created in less damaged areas, but conditions were harsh. The injured lay on floors with little pain relief, while medical staff struggled to prioritize care. Communication with the outside world was again disrupted, though news of Hiroshima had already raised fears that a new type of weapon was in. When confirmation came that another atomic bomb had destroyed Nagasaki, the psychological impact deepened. The idea that such devastation could be repeated shook both military leaders and civilians. In the days that followed, the pattern of radiation sickness became clearer. People who had seemed unhurt began to lose hair, develop infections, and suffer internal bleeding. Some died suddenly, others endured prolonged illness. Pregnant women worried about their unborn children, and families feared invisible contamination they could neither see nor avoid. Food and clean water were hard to find, increasing the risk of disease. Yet amid the suffering, acts of compassion appeared. Survivors shared what little they had, strangers carried the injured, and communities tried to rebuild a sense of support, even in ruins. The bombing of Nagasaki, combined with Hiroshima and the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan, created immense pressure on Japanese leadership. Within days, the decision was made to surrender. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, bringing World War II to an end. For many around the world, the war's conclusion brought relief and celebration. But in Nagasaki, as in Hiroshima, the end of fighting did not end suffering. The cities faced long roads of recovery, mourning, and uncertainty about the future. In the years after the bombing, the people of Nagasaki confronted long-term health effects similar to those in Hiroshima. Cancer rates increased, especially leukemia in children. Cataracts, chronic fatigue, and other conditions appeared more frequently among survivors. Social challenges emerged as well. Some hibakusha faced discrimination due to fears that radiation sickness was contagious or that they might not be healthy enough to marry or work. Despite this, many survivors chose to speak publicly about their experiences. Their testimonies became crucial in global discussions about nuclear weapon and the humanitarian consequences of their use. The physical rebuilding of Nagasaki transformed the city over time. New buildings rose where ruins had stood, and memorials were established to honor the dead. Peace parks and museums were created as places for reflection and education. Every year, ceremonies remember the moment of the explosion and call for a world without nuclear war. The city's identity became closely tied to messages of peace, resilience, and remembrance. Survivors emphasized that while they could not change the past, they could share their stories so that future generations might avoid repeating such tragedy. The second atomic bombing reinforced a new and troubling reality for humanity: that technological progress could outpace moral and political systems designed to control it. The destructive power demonstrated in Nagasaki showed that entire cities could be erased in moments, and that the consequences would last for decades. This realization influenced internet, ion relations, leading to nuclear arms races, but also to efforts at arms control and non-proliferation. Debates continue about the decision to use the bombs, their role in ending the war, and the ethical boundaries of warfare. Yet beyond political arguments, the human stories from Nagasaki remain central, stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary horror. Children who survived grew up with memories of fire and loss. Some dedicated their lives to medicine, peace activism, or education, hoping to transform suffering into purpose. Artists, writers, and filmmakers from Nagasaki expressed grief and hope through their work, ensuring that the emotional truth of the event would not be forgotten. The landscape itself carries memory. Certain areas were rebuilt as open spaces to mark the scale of destruction, while artifacts melted or twisted by heat are preserved as silent witnesses. Looking back, the bombing of Nagasaki stands as a stark chapter in human history, illustrating both the extremes of wartime decision-making and the enduring strength of those who survive. The city's experience underscores the reality that war's consequences extend far beyond battlefields and soldiers, reaching deep into civilian lives and future generations. The flash that morning lasted only seconds, but its effects have stretched across decades, shaping policies, movements, and moral reflection worldwide. Through remembrance and education, Nagasaki's story continues to serve as a warning about the cost of nuclear conflict and the fragile value of peace. In the weeks and months after the atomic bombings, the suffering in the ruined cities did not end with the fading of fires or the clearing of smoke. Instead, a slower and in many ways more haunting chapter began, one defined by illness, uncertainty, grief, and the struggle to rebuild lives and landscapes permanently changed. Survivors emerged from shelters, riverbanks, and makeshift aid stations into cities that barely resembled the places they had known. Streets were gone, landmarks erased, and familiar neighborhoods reduced to open fields of debris and ash. People searched for family members by walking through blackened ruins, calling names, checking lists posted at relief points, and visiting hospitals overwhelmed with the injured. Many never found answers. Entire households had vanished in the blasts, leaving behind only fragments of daily life, melted dishes, twisted bicycles, scraps of clothing, scattered across the ground. Workers faced a crisis unlike anything in their training. Burns covered large portions of victims' bodies, and infections spread quickly in the hot summer weather. But alongside these visible injuries were strange symptoms that puzzled doctors. People who had seemed healthy began to grow weak days later. They vomited, developed high fevers, and suffered severe diarrhea. Their hair fell out, and they developed bleeding from gums and under the skin. Wounds that had started to heal peened. Some patients improved briefly, giving hope, only to suddenly decline and die. Physicians gradually realized they were witnessing the effects of radiation exposure, though knowledge about it was limited. They could offer little more than rest, basic nursing care, and comfort. For many families, watching loved ones fade away after surviving the initial blast was an especially cruel ordeal, stretching grief over weeks instead of moments. Children were among the most vulnerable. Many had been outdoors during the explosions or in school buildings that collapsed. Those who survived often carried deep burns and injuries, but even those without obvious wounds sometimes fell ill later. Orphans wandered the ruins or stayed in crowded shelters, cared for by relatives, neighbors, or aid organizations when possible. Malnutrition added to the crisis. Food supplies had already been strained by years of war, and the destruction of transport and storage facilities made distribution even harder. People traded possessions for rice or vegetables, while relief shipments slowly arrived from other regions. Clean water was scarce in the early days, increasing the risk of disease outbreaks. Psychological trauma weighed heavily on survivors. Many experienced recurring nightmares, sudden panic at loud noises, and feelings of guilt for having lived when others had died. Some spoke of survivors' guilt, questioning why they had been spared while family members perished. The sight of burns, scars, and disfigurement served as constant reminders of the events. Social life changed as well. In some cases, survivors faced discrimination from others who feared radiation effects, believing incorrectly that exposure might be contagious or hereditary in ways that would affect marriage prospects. Young women, in particular, sometimes worried they would not be able to find partners due to fears about future health problems or children's well-being. As months passed, longer-term health effects began to appear more clearly. Doctors recorded higher rates of leukemia, especially among children who had been close to the blast. Other cancers, including those of the thyroid, breast, and lungs, increased over time. Cataracts developed earlier than usual in many exposed individuals. Chronic fatigue, immune system problems, and various organ disorders became part of daily life for some. Medical studies, born from tragedy, contributed to global understanding of radiation's impact on the human body. At the same time, survivors often felt like subjects of research rather than people whose suffering needed relief. Balancing scientific investigation with compassionate care became an ongoing challenge. Amid these hardships, efforts to rebuild began. Clearing rubble was slow and dangerous, as unexploded ordnance, unstable structures, and contamination posed risks. Yet people were determined to restore some sense of normality. Temporary housing sprang up, followed by more permanent structures. Schools reopened in surviving buildings or simple classrooms, allowing children to resume education. Markets reappeared, and small businesses tried to restart. Religious and community leaders organized memorial services and support networks. Shared loss created strong bonds among survivors, who leaned on each other in ways that sometimes transcended previous social divisions. The bombings also hanged global politics and culture in profound ways. The demonstration of nuclear weapons' destructive power ushered in a new era often called the Atomic Age. Nations realized that future wars could threaten entire civilizations. This led to an arms race as countries sought to develop their own nuclear arsenals, but also to movements advocating control and disarmament. Survivors' testimonies played a key role in these efforts. When Hibakusha traveled or spoke publicly, describing the flash, the burns, and the slow illnesses, their words carried moral weight beyond statistics or military arguments. Their experiences became central to campaigns warning of nuclear war's humanitarian consequences. Art, literature, and film also reflected the bombing's legacy. Writers described the surreal landscapes of destroyed cities and the emotional aftermath. Artists painted scenes of fire, shadows, and rebirth. These works helped people process grief and communicate experiences that were otherwise difficult to express. Memorial parks and museums were established, preserving remnants like melted bottles, fused roof tiles, and damaged clothing. Such objects, ordinary before the blast, became powerful symbols of lives interrupted. Annual remembrance ceremonies brought together survivors, officials, and visitors to honor the dead and renew calls for peace. Over time, the cities transformed. Modern buildings, roads, and parks replaced much of the devastation, and younger generations grew up in environments very different from the ruins of 1945. Yet memory remained embedded in the landscape through monuments, preserved ruins, and stories passed down in families. Education about the bombings became part of local identity, with schoolchildren learning not only historical facts, but also personal narratives from elders. This transmission of memory aimed to ensure that the suffering would not be forgotten as eyewitnesses aged. The legacy of radiation extended into future generations Although fears of widespread genetic damage were often greater than scientific evidence supported, some children born to survivors did experience health challenges, and the anxiety surrounding reproduction was real. Medical follow-ups and support programs developed over decades, reflecting a long-term commitment to care. At the same time, debates continued internationally about the ethics of nuclear deterrence, the justifications for using the bombs, and the responsibilities of nations possessing such weapons. These discussions were shaped not only by strategy, but by the human images of burned cities and injured civilians. For survivors themselves, life became a balance between remembering and moving forward. Many married, worked, and raised families, contributing to society despite physical and emotional scars. Some kept their experiences private for years, speaking only later in life. Others became outspoken activists, visiting schools and conferences to share their stories. The IR message often emphasized the value of peace, empathy, and dialogue over hatred or revenge. Having seen the extreme outcome of war, they urged younger generations to resolve conflicts without violence. Nature, too, played a role in recovery. Trees and plants gradually returned to areas once thought barren, offering visible signs of renewal. Cherry blossoms blooming in rebuilt cities became symbols of resilience, linking present beauty with past sorrow. Such contrasts, life growing where destruction once ruled, deepened the emotional complexity of remembrance. Hope did not erase tragedy, but it showed that healing, though incomplete, was possible. Decades later, as technology advanced and global tensions shifted, the bombings remained a reference point whenever nuclear issues arose. Crises involving nuclear weapons were often discussed in light of the humanitarian impact first witnessed in those cities. Survivors' voices, though fewer as time passed, continued to remind the world that behind every strategic term are human lives. Their accounts of thirst, burns, missing family members, and lingering illness grounded abstract debates in lived reality. Ultimately, the long aftermath of the atomic bombings reveals that the true duration of such events cannot be measured in minutes or days. The explosions themselves were brief, but their consequences stretched across lifetimes and generations. They reshaped cities, health, politics, culture, and moral thinking worldwide. The survivors' endurance, combined with their willingness to remember and to speak, turned personal tragedy into a global call for caution and compassion. Their STO. Rees stand as enduring reminders that decisions made in moments of war can echo through decades, affecting not only those present but countless others yet to be born. When the war ended, and the immediate shock of the bombings began to settle into memory, a new phase of reality unfolded for the survivors, one shaped not by sudden flashes and explosions, but by long years of adjustment in a world permanently altered. The end of fighting did not bring a return to the old normal. Instead, people in the affected cities faced the complex task of rebuilding their identities, along with their homes. Entire neighborhoods had to be redesigned from empty ground, and with that physical rebuilding came emotional and cultural reconstruction. Families created new routines in temporary housing, cooking simple meals over shared stoves, sleeping in cramped rooms divided by thin walls or curtains. Privacy was rare, yet communities formed strong support systems. Neighbors shared food, tools, and stories, CRE, aiding a sense of solidarity born from shared suffering. Education became a powerful symbol of hope. Schools reopened even when classrooms had no proper desks or books. Teachers, many of whom were survivors themselves, worked to provide stability for children who had seen unimaginable horrors. Lessons were not only about reading and arithmetic, but also about cooperation, peace, and resilience. Children who had lost parents were supported by extended family networks or community groups. Though memories of the bombing lingered, laughter slowly returned to playgrounds, showing the human capacity to seek joy even after tragedy. At the same time, these young people carried invisible burdens. Some had recurring health issues, others grew up with stories of that day shaping their understanding of the world. Economic recovery was gradual. Factories and businesses were rebuilt, sometimes with modern designs that changed the character of the cities. International aid and national programs, contributed resources, but much of the progress came from the hard work of residents themselves. Craftspeople reopened workshops, farmers cultivated land outside the cities, and merchants re-established trade. Markets filled again with voices and movement, yet prosperity was uneven. Survivors dealing with chronic illness or disability often struggled to find steady employment. Medical expenses weighed heavily on families, and government assistance programs evolved slowly to meet long-term needs. The cultural memory of the bombings deepened over time. Anniversaries became days of reflection marked by ceremonies, moments of silence, and the floating of lanterns or the ringing of bells. These rituals provided space for mourning and for renewing commitments to peace. Museums collected testimonies, photographs, and objects damaged by the blasts, preserving them for future generations. Guides, often survivors or their descendants, explain the significance of exhibits to visitors from around the world. Listening to these accounts, many people felt a personal connection to events that had once seemed distant in time or geography. Globally, the bombings influenced how nations thought about security and power. The existence of nuclear weapons introduced a constant tension into international relations. On one hand, some leaders argued that such weapons prevented large-scale wars through deterrence. On the other, activists warned that their use would bring humanitarian catastrophe beyond control. Survivors' experiences were central to these warnings. When they described skin hanging from arms, black rain falling after the blast, or the silence of a city where voices had once filled the air, they gave human faces to abstract policy debates. Their words traveled across borders, contributing to treaties and discussions aimed at limiting nuclear proliferation. Within the cities themselves, nature and time softened some visible scars but never erased memory. Trees planted in the years after the war grew tall, shading streets that had once been bare. Rivers that had carried injured people seeking relief flowed calmly again, reflecting new bridges and buildings. Yet certain landmarks were preserved in damaged form as reminders. Standing walls or structures became symbols of endurance and loss, visited by students and tourists alike. These sites encouraged reflection not only on past suffering, but also on responsibility toward the future. Family stories played a vital role in keeping history alive. Grandparents told grandchildren where they had been when the flash came, how they searched for loved ones, and how they rebuilt. Personal narratives complemented official histories, ensuring that memory remained rooted in lived experience. For some survivors, speaking openly took years. Trauma sometimes made silence easier than revisiting painful memories. As they aged, however, many felt an urgency to share their stories before it was too late. Their testimonies, gifts to the world, offered in the hope that understanding might prevent repetition. Artistic expression continued to interpret the legacy of the bombings. Poems, novels, paintings, and films explored themes of loss, guilt, renewal, and peace. Through metaphor and imagery, artists conveyed emotions that statistics could not. A single drawing of a burned tricycle or a poem about shadows on stone could evoke deep empathy. Cultural exchange programs brought these works to international audiences, building bridges of understanding. Visitors often left with a sense of shared humanity that transcended national boundaries. Medical research related to radiation effects continued for decades, improving knowledge that later informed responses to other nuclear incidents and medical treatments involving radiation. Yet for survivors, participation in studies was often a reminder of the cause of their health problems. Balancing scientific progress with sensitivity to personal suffering remained important. Support groups formed where survivors could discuss health concerns and emotional challenges. These networks provided comfort and reduced feelings of isolation. As generations passed, the direct memory of the bombings shifted from lived experience to historical understanding. Educators faced the challenge of conveying the emotional weight of events to students born long after the war. Interactive exhibits, survivor videos, and peace education programs aimed to keep the lessons vivid. The goal was not only to remember tragedy, but to inspire responsibility. Young people were encouraged to think critically about conflict, to value dialogue, and to recognize the shared vulnerability of all human communities. The long arc of recovery shows both the resilience and fragility of human societies. Cities once reduced to rubble became vibrant again, demonstrating capacity for renewal. At the same time, the possibility of similar destruction remained present in global arsenals. This contrast gives the history enduring relevance. The bombings are not only stories of the past, but warnings for the future. They remind humanity that scientific knowledge carries moral weight and that choices made by leaders affect ordinary lives in profound ways. In daily life today, the legacy appears in small gestures as well as grand memorials. Paper cranes folded as symbols of peace, moments of silence in classrooms, and quiet visits to memorial stones all express a commitment to remember. Survivors' children and grandchildren often participate in these acts, carrying forward a heritage shaped by both pain and determination. The cities stand as living memorials where ordinary life, shopping, studying, celebrating, coexists with remembrance. Looking across the decades, one sees that the true story is not only about destruction, but also about endurance, compassion, and the search for meaning after loss. People who experienced the unimaginable chose again and again to rebuild rather than surrender to despair. Their lives illustrate that while human beings can create terrible harm, they can also create communities of care and movements for peace. The legacy of those events continues to challenge the world to pursue security without sacrificing humanity, and to remember that every city is, at heart, a place of families, dreams, and fragile lives worthy of protection.